They fired me in front of 200 people. No warning. No severance. Just humiliation served cold by a smug 20-something with a microphone. Tyler Coleman, the CEO's golden nephew, grinned like he'd won a prize. His uncle Richard stood in the front row, arms crossed, silent, letting it happen. That silence said it all. I was disposable. But here's what they didn't know. When they erased me, they triggered the one clause in their system I still controlled. And that mistake was about to cost them $250,000 every single minute. The auditorium was too bright. The kind of blinding, buzzing light that makes everything look cheap, even when the company spent millions renovating the space. 200 employees sat shoulder to shoulder, sipping burnt coffee from paper cups, staring at the stage like it was a circus. And in a way, it was. Richard Coleman, the CEO, stood in the front row like a statue. His eyes didn't move, his jaw didn't shift. He didn't need to speak. That was his style, silence as intimidation. Next to him, holding the microphone like it was a trophy, stood his nephew Tyler. The kid who had never worked a day in his life, but strutted around as if he'd invented electricity. "Let's keep this quick," Tyler said, smiling into the mic. "There's dead weight in this company. And today, we're cutting it loose." I already knew. The email sent at 8:04 a.m. was a single line, mandatory, all hands in the atrium. No agenda, no details. That was the style here. Trap you in front of everyone, humiliate you, then move on like nothing happened. Tyler stretched the moment, letting the silence drag. He wanted drama. He wanted eyes on me. And when he finally said my name, he leaned into the microphone like an entertainer about to deliver a punchline. "Ava North," he said. "Step up." The crowd shifted. Chairs squeaked. My coworkers looked anywhere but at me. Some fiddled with their phones, others stared at the floor. Nobody wanted to be caught watching. I stood. My knees didn't shake, but my hands balled into fists. I walked toward the stage, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead mixing with the click of my shoes. Tyler smirked, waiting. "This company," he said, gesturing to the giant logo glowing on the wall behind him, "is about progress. About discipline. About respect." Unfortunately, Ava doesn't understand those values. There it was. The script. Always the same. They wouldn't say incompetence because they couldn't prove that. My work held this place together. Every system, every contract, every vendor chain had my fingerprints on it. No, they'd go with something vague. Something that sounded serious, but meant nothing. "You undermined leadership," Tyler continued. "You resisted change. And worst of all, you wasted this company's time." The words hung in the air. I almost laughed. Wasted time? This from the guy who spent most of his day scrolling through stock apps and bragging about weekend parties. I turned my head, scanning the crowd. 200 faces frozen. Some wide-eyed, some blank. A few with the faintest trace of pity. Not one of them spoke. Not one of them dared. Tyler leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough to sound like a private insult, even though the microphone caught every syllable. "You're done here, Ava. No severance. No appeal. Effective immediately." The room buzzed. Not from the lights this time, but from the collective intake of breath. That line, "no severance," hit like a gunshot. It wasn't just cruel, it was reckless. The company had policies. But policies meant nothing when Richard stood silent, his arms crossed, letting his nephew run the show. I opened my mouth, then shut it. There was no point arguing. The stage wasn't built for me. It was built for my humiliation. Tyler grinned, basking in the attention. "Let's give her a hand, everyone. Years of service, sure. But in the end, not every role is permanent." The silence was louder than any applause. No one clapped. Chairs creaked, someone coughed, but the rest was dead air. Tyler didn't notice. He was too busy enjoying himself. I looked at Richard. His eyes met mine for a second, cold, detached, like I was already erased from memory. And in that second, I made my decision. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I simply stepped closer to the microphone, leaned in, and let my voice carry across the room. "You think you've finished me," I said, steady and calm. "But when I walked out this morning, I left something behind. Something you can't control. And when it goes off, you'll bleed money at $250,000 a minute." The room went still. Richard's expression didn't change. Tyler's smirk faltered for the first time all morning. I stepped back, let the silence stretch, then turned and walked off the stage. The detonator was already ticking. The applause never came. 200 people just stared as if silence could protect them. When I walked back to my desk, a cardboard box was already waiting. HR efficiency or cruelty. I started filling it without ceremony. A half-dead plant, a chipped mug, a few pens that barely worked. The kind of junk that made me look replaceable, though every system in this building leaned on my work. Jessica Miller from HR hovered by the corner, clutching a tablet like a shield. "If you need someone to walk you out," she began. I cut her off. "I know the way." Her face tightened, then she turned on her heel. She didn't want to be here any more than I did. Around me, whispers spread in waves. Some coworkers pretended to type, screens glowing with empty spreadsheets. Others leaned too far back in their chairs, listening. Their eyes darted to me, then away, like I was radioactive. Marcus Reed passed through the aisle. He didn't say a word, but when our eyes met, he gave a tiny nod. Quick, deliberate. He knew something. Maybe not everything, but enough. I slid my leather-bound notebook into the box last. The blue binder wasn't here, it was stored safely in my apartment, but my fingers brushed the empty spot in the filing cabinet where it used to sit. That small touch was a reminder. They'd forgotten what I controlled. Instead of walking out through the glass corridor the executives loved to parade through, I took the back route. Past the jammed supply closet that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. Past the server room door where the keycard always failed the first swipe. Past the fuse box no one had checked in months. The skeleton of the building. The part only people like me bothered to memorize. At the lobby turnstiles, 2 guards watched me badge out. Neither said a word. One just gave me a quick glance, the kind you give a condemned prisoner, half pity, half relief it's not you. The sunlight in the parking lot was blinding. I loaded the box into the back seat of my car. Papers slid out, half hanging from the side. I didn't fix them. Let them spill. It was fitting. For a moment, I sat behind the wheel without turning the key. My eyes stayed on the mirrored glass of the building. 200 employees inside, trying to work like nothing had happened, pretending they hadn't just witnessed a staged execution. I should have felt hollow. Or broken. Instead, I felt sharp. Focused. Like the board was already set, and I'd seen their next 10 moves. They thought they'd erased me. What they'd really done was trip a wire they didn't even know existed. I started the engine and pulled out. At home, waiting for me on the dining table by the window, sat the dark blue binder with the frayed spine, the one document that could turn their empire into ash. They wanted me gone. They got their wish. Now I'd show them the cost. By the time I got home, the city had shifted into its late afternoon rhythm, horns, sirens, the occasional echo of construction drills. I didn't bother turning on the lights. I dropped my box of office junk by the door and went straight to the dining table in the corner of the living room. On top sat a dark blue binder with a frayed spine. Not pretty, not new, but more valuable than anything Richard Coleman kept in his glass office upstairs. I pulled out the chair, sat down, and opened it. Contracts, service agreements, amendment after amendment. Years of meticulous records. Most employees never even knew this binder existed. Executives sure as hell didn't. To them, details were boring. To me, details were leverage. Page after page I scanned, highlighting clauses with a yellow marker until I reached the one that mattered. Clause 14. 2. Buried in legal jargon, but I'd memorized every word months ago. In the event of termination of the designated continuity officer without formal transition or documented handover, service providers are required to suspend critical processes until compliance review is complete. There it was. My insurance policy. The company had stripped my badge, humiliated me in front of the crowd, and pushed me out without a single handover document. By their own contracts, that triggered a mandatory freeze. The penalties? $250,000 per minute. Non-negotiable. I leaned back in the chair and let the weight of it settle. They thought they'd killed my career. What they'd really done was arm me with a weapon they never saw coming. The binder wasn't the only piece. Next to it sat my old laptop, open to a folder of compliance logs I'd saved for myself. Not stolen, saved. Everything routed through official portals, time-stamped, traceable. Perfectly clean. I flipped to another section in the binder marked with a bent tab, vendor obligations. Every provider tied to us had to act on compliance triggers. Meaning if I filed the right report, they wouldn't just shut down, they'd report the shutdown up the chain, escalating to legal teams and regulators. A chain reaction. One clause, one signature, and the company would start bleeding money by the second. The phone buzzed on the table. An unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. I already knew what it was, Jessica Miller from HR, rehearsing some formal separation process speech. Too late. Instead, I pulled a notepad closer and made a list. File formal notice with vendor. File secondary notice with property management. Record timestamp of both submissions. Wait. Simple steps. Clean. No drama. Just process. Through the window, the building across the street flickered with office lights coming on for the night shift. People still working, chasing deadlines, missing dinners. I'd lived that grind for years. Now I was on the other side of it. I closed the blue binder, running my hand over its worn cover. This wasn't just paper. It was a detonator. And tomorrow I was pulling the pin. Morning came, and I wasn't going back to the office. Not through those glass doors, not past those fake smiles. My battlefield was smaller now, a dining table, a laptop, and a battered blue binder. But it was enough. I logged into the vendor compliance portal. Username, password, two-factor code. My access hadn't been revoked yet. Another mistake. Their IT team thought badge access was the same thing as system access. Marcus Reed knew better, but Marcus wasn't the one making calls anymore. The portal loaded. I opened a new submission. Continuity violation report. Field 1, terminated without handover. Field 2, designated continuity officer not replaced. Attachments, digital scans of the signed binder pages, highlighted clause 14. 2, and last week's calendar metadata showing no transition meetings. I hit submit. The screen blinked, then confirmed with a timestamp. 9:12 a.m. irreversible. Next step, property management. Sandra Ortega's office had a separate reporting line for compliance flags tied to building operations. I uploaded the same documents, attached the timestamp, and filed under operational risk. Another confirmation number popped up, another clock started ticking. That was it. 2 clicks, 2 filings, and the fuse was lit. I sat back, staring at the binder, at the laptop, at the list I'd scribbled the night before. It looked too simple. But the math was brutal. The vendor was contractually obligated to enforce a freeze. No handover, no exceptions. Every stalled minute cost the company $250,000. By 9:20 a.m., the penalty meter was already running. The phone rang again. This time it was a number I recognized, Jessica Miller, HR. I let it ring until voicemail clicked in. Seconds later, the email arrived. Subject, clarification on separation process. Body, Ava, we'd like to formalize your exit paperwork and ensure a smooth transition. Smooth transition. I laughed out loud. Too late for that. I replied with one line. Please direct all inquiries to the vendor compliance portal. Submission ID 45712. At 9:47, the first email from the vendor hit my inbox. Notice, critical service freeze enforced. Estimated losses accruing per contractual penalty schedule. The words looked sterile, clinical. But I could imagine the panic echoing through Richard Coleman's executive suite. Phones ringing, voices raised, Tyler pretending to have solutions while sweating through his expensive shirt. By 10:15, another email came. This one flagged to the CFO. I wasn't supposed to see it, but someone had looped me in by mistake. Lauren Davis had calculated the penalty schedule allowed in a meeting, and the system had recorded her as the designated recipient. Every minute, $250,000. Every hour, $15 million. The number sat there, bold and undeniable. I leaned forward, typing a final note in my log. Clock running. No intervention possible without compliance reversal. Somewhere across town, Richard Coleman was probably pounding his desk. Tyler was probably shouting about sabotage. And Jessica was probably drafting another urgent email. But none of it mattered. The trigger had already been pulled. The money was already pouring out of the company like water through a crack in the dam. And just when I thought things couldn't get worse for them, Marcus dropped something into my inbox. No words. No subject line. Just one attachment. I opened it and smiled. It was a keycard log. Simple, clean, undeniable. And right there, glowing like a spotlight, was Tyler Coleman. He had swiped into the restricted server room the night before my firing. A place he had no reason to be. Perfect. I didn't accuse him of anything. I didn't have to. I slipped the file into my ongoing compliance report as supporting context. No comments, no explanations, just the facts. The kind of facts lawyers choke on. By the time Richard's team saw it, panic must have been spreading like wildfire. Because not long after, Jessica from HR came clawing at my inbox with frantic emails, all dripping with fake politeness. Ava, could you please confirm the accuracy of this information? I typed one line back. Yes, that was enough. I leaned back in my chair, imagining the scene inside their glass conference room. Tyler's face flushing red as Lauren, the CFO, shoved the log in front of him. His excuses spilling out too fast, too loud. Richard sitting stone still, saying nothing, but letting his silence grind his nephew into dust. The beauty of it? I didn't need to say a single word. Tyler's own arrogance had done the heavy lifting for me. He'd wanted to play executive, wanted to look important. Now his late-night joyride into a server room had become Exhibit A in a growing disaster. The whispers started almost immediately. Employees leaking half-truths online, posting cryptic complaints before deleting them. But screenshots live forever. And once the story slipped into the wild, the Coleman name was attached to it. I closed my laptop satisfied. The company thought they had erased me. Instead, they had put their golden boy right in the crosshairs. And the best part? The clock was still running. Every tick draining another $250,000. Every second turning their empire into quicksand. Tyler had opened the wrong door. And now it was going to swallow him whole. By the next morning, the company was already drowning. The freeze had gone live, and nothing was moving. Orders stuck in limbo. Clients screaming down the phone lines. Entire teams staring at frozen dashboards like deer in headlights. I didn't need to be in the building to feel it. Panic has a way of traveling through the air like smoke. The first real sign came through a message forwarded to me by a friend still inside. Lauren Davis, the CFO, had done the math out loud in a meeting. That was her mistake. $250,000 a minute, she said. That's $15 million an hour. And then there was silence. A silence so heavy people could feel it pressing down on them, even through the glass walls of the conference room. Tyler must have shifted in his chair. I could picture it, his cocky posture collapsing inch by inch as the numbers sank in. For once, his grin was gone. Richard sat at the head of the table unmoving. No outbursts. No denials. Just the weight of his silence, letting everyone else sweat. The scramble started immediately. Emergency calls to vendors. Rushed paperwork shoved through systems that weren't built to bend. Fake signatures on forms that looked official until anyone with half a brain checked the metadata. It didn't matter. The freeze wasn't a switch they could flip back on. It was a lock sealed tight by the very contracts they had signed and ignored. Sandra Ortega, the property manager, even got dragged in. She shut down access to certain rooms in the building until compliance was restored. Picture it, executives rattling locked doors in their own empire, desperate to claw their way back in. And outside those glass walls? Employees watching, whispering, pretending to work while the company bled out by the second. I imagined the scene, and for once, I let myself enjoy it. Not out of cruelty, though God knows they'd earned it, but because it was justice. Cold, mathematical justice. They wanted me gone. They wanted silence. And now they had it, a silence worth $250,000 every single minute. I checked my watch. By the time Richard's team finished their first round of frantic calls, they'd already lost close to $50 million. And that was just day one. By the second day, chaos had a rhythm. Phones rang in overlapping waves. Executives stormed in and out of rooms with faces pale enough to match the walls. Every attempt to patch the hole just tore it wider. They tried everything. First came the fake signatures. Someone thought slapping Richard's name on a backdated handover form would convince the vendor to lift the freeze. It didn't survive 10 minutes. Metadata doesn't lie, and lawyers don't forgive. Next came the emergency continuity officer. They pulled some mid-level manager into a boardroom, gave him a shiny title, and shoved a stack of forms in front of him. The vendor rejected it before the ink dried. Clause 14. 2 was clear. Without my handover, there was no continuity. Period. Meanwhile, Sandra Ortega tightened the screws. She blocked access to critical areas of the building, citing safety protocols. Executives with $5,000 suits were reduced to rattling doorknobs, locked out of their own infrastructure. Employees whispered about it like school kids watching teachers lose control of the classroom. And Tyler? Tyler melted down. He paced the hallways, snapping at anyone who made eye contact. The swagger was gone. All that was left was panic, messy and loud. I wasn't there, but I didn't need to be. The reports reached me through whispers, screenshots, even the occasional photo from someone still inside. People who once ignored me now treated me like a ghost haunting the building. And I kept feeding the fire. Quietly. Calmly. Every clarification request Jessica from HR sent me, I answered with one-liners that nailed the coffin shut. Refer to Clause 14. 2. Submission already filed. Documentation attached. No emotion. No explanations. Just enough fuel to keep the machine grinding itself to pieces. The numbers grew obscene. 100 million gone before lunch. 200 million by evening. Even if they found a miracle fix, the penalties were already burned into the ledger. I imagined Richard, sitting at the head of his table, surrounded by frantic executives. Everyone shouting, Tyler sweating, Jessica babbling, Lauren begging for time. And Richard? Silent. Always silent. His power was in what he didn't say. But silence doesn't stop a ticking clock. By the time the sun set, the company wasn't just scrambling. It was unraveling. And I was only just getting started. By the third day, the building wasn't buzzing anymore, it was cracking. You could hear it in the tone of their emails, see it in the desperate spin of their press releases. The veneer was gone. That's when Richard finally tried to flex. The letter came through my attorney, David Patel. Heavy stationery, bold header, written by some overpriced law firm that thought intimidation still worked. It was the usual nonsense: accusations of misconduct, demands for immediate cooperation, vague threats about further consequences. I read it once, then slid it across the table to David. He smirked. They're bluffing. Of course they were. The contracts weren't on their side. The timeline wasn't on their side. And deep down, Richard knew it. But silence was no longer enough, so he tried a different weapon: fear. David crafted our response in under an hour. No theatrics, no threats. Just a clean packet of evidence. Timelines, policy citations, vendor confirmations, and the golden piece, a copy of the blue binder page, signed last quarter by Olivia Brooks, VP of Operations, acknowledging Clause 14. 2. One email, one attachment, and the whole facade of their letter collapsed. The silence that followed was better than any victory speech. An hour passed. Then 2. Nothing. Inside their glass fortress, the pressure must have been unbearable. Employees leaked stories faster now, executives screaming at each other, Tyler slamming doors, CFO looking ready to faint. For once, people weren't afraid to talk. They wanted me to know what was happening. And that's when I realized something important. I wasn't just dismantling the company. I was watching its people shift. The same coworkers who had sat in silence during my public firing were now feeding me information, rooting for me from the shadows. Fear was contagious. But so was defiance. By evening, David forwarded me another letter. Shorter this time. No bluster. Just a single line at the end. Our client is open to negotiation. Negotiation. The first crack in Richard Coleman's armor. I closed my laptop and leaned back, letting the weight of it sink in. They weren't in control anymore. The freeze was working, the penalties were growing, and now they were the ones chasing me. For the first time since walking off that stage, I allowed myself a real smile. The empire wasn't just bleeding money. It was begging. And cracks only get wider. The freeze had turned into a black hole, pulling everything inside it. But the real hit came from a slip of the tongue. Late that night, Lauren Davis, the CFO, lost her composure. A message meant for an internal thread landed in my lap, courtesy of someone who clearly wanted me to see it. And there it was, plain as day. Richard personally guaranteed the bridge loan. If this outage hits covenant thresholds, the bank steps in. I read it 3 times. Then I laughed. The great Richard Coleman, the man who treated contracts like toys and silence like a weapon, had signed his own noose. To push through a product launch, he'd gone to the bank. To convince them, he'd put his own name on the line. If the systems froze for too long, it wouldn't just be the company drowning. It would be him. Personally. That changed everything. This wasn't just about corporate money anymore. This was about his house, his assets, his empire. And the timer was already deep into the red. The image burned in my mind. Richard in his corner office, Tyler pacing like a caged animal, Lauren wringing her hands as she admitted the truth. Tyler shouting something about fixing it, Richard staring at him with that dead-eyed silence, realizing his own bloodline had helped drag him into ruin. Jessica Miller from HR tried again. Another desperate email. Ava, if you'd be willing to meet, I'm sure we could find a resolution. Resolution. Funny word. I sent no reply. Instead, I logged everything. Every leak, every mistake, every slip that came my way. David Patel already had a file thick enough to crush any courtroom if it ever came to that. I wasn't chasing chaos anymore, I was documenting it. Building a case one timestamp at a time. And while they scrambled, the clock ticked. By my estimate, Richard's personal guarantee had already crossed the danger zone. The bank wouldn't wait forever. They'd circle like sharks, smelling blood, ready to claim collateral. I poured a glass of water, set it beside the binder, and let the thought settle in. Richard Coleman wasn't fighting for his company anymore. He was fighting for himself. And he was losing. I always knew the walls of that company were thinner than they looked. Secrets travel fast when everyone inside is terrified, and fear was the only language left in that building. It started with a single message on my phone. Do you want to comment on the Coleman system shutdown? No introduction, no explanation, just straight to the point. Journalists don't waste time when they know a story is about to explode. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The fact they had my number meant someone inside had cracked. And once one person starts talking, the rest follow like dominoes. By midday, the rumors were everywhere. Employees whispering on anonymous forums. Screenshots of stalled systems circulating in private chat groups. A vague but damning line on social media. Compliance freeze triggered by leadership mistake. Tyler's name hadn't surfaced yet, but the questions circling around it were obvious. Unauthorized access? Family interference? Who pulled the plug? Reporters don't ask unless they already suspect. Tyler had become a ghost in every conversation, the shadow nobody dared to name, but everyone pointed toward. Inside the company, panic took a different shape. PR scrambled to craft statements, the kind stuffed with corporate jargon, temporary disruptions, scheduled maintenance. We are addressing the situation proactively. But the market isn't stupid. Shareholders read between the lines, and every empty word sent the stock sliding further down. I imagined the scene clearly. Richard Coleman sitting at the head of his glossy conference table, jaw locked, refusing to admit how cornered he was. PR reps flipping through draft after draft, waiting for a nod that never came. Lauren Davis staring at the numbers, pale and silent. And Tyler, loud, restless, desperate, offering to take the spotlight, to handle the press himself. The thought almost made me laugh. Giving Tyler a microphone would have been like handing a match to someone already standing in gasoline. From my apartment, I watched the chaos unfold through leaks and updates. I didn't lift a finger. The beauty of it was that I didn't have to. They had set the fire themselves, and now the world was watching them burn through their own fortune minute by minute. By evening, the first article dropped in a major outlet. The headline hit like a hammer. Coleman Systems faces multi-million compliance freeze after leadership decisions. No spin, no sugarcoating. Leadership decisions. That was the polite version. But to anyone who had ever worked in a corporate tower, it meant one thing: failure at the top. And once failure at the top becomes public, investors smell weakness. Partners distance themselves. Employees stop pretending they're loyal. It's the beginning of the end. I closed my laptop and sat back, the blue binder still open beside me. For years, I'd been the invisible one, the woman in the corner who caught mistakes before they became disasters. No one noticed. No one cared. Now, without lifting a finger, I had become the headline they couldn't escape. Richard's empire wasn't just losing money anymore. It was losing its mask. And nothing falls faster than a company once people stop believing in its story. The article had been bad. The investors showing up in person was worse. But the moment I knew the company was collapsing for real was when the lobby itself turned into a waiting room for vultures. They came in waves. First a few, then dozens. Men and women in tailored suits, carrying leather portfolios and clipped expressions. They didn't sit politely in conference rooms. They clustered in the lobby, leaning against marble columns, talking in low, sharp voices. Employees passing by kept their heads down. No one wanted to be caught eavesdropping, but the tension was impossible to ignore. Upstairs, the boardroom had become a pressure cooker. People who'd once strutted with confidence now moved like trapped animals. Lauren Davis shuffled through endless printouts, her hands shaking so badly that half the pages slid off the table. "Richard," she said at one point, her voice cracking. "We can't hold this line much longer. The penalties are compounding faster than our liquidity can cover. We're running out of runway. Richard didn't respond. He sat at the head of the table, eyes narrowed, fingers steepled. His silence had once commanded respect. Now it only deepened the panic. Tyler couldn't stand the silence. He slammed his fist against the table. This is ridiculous. We just need to get control of the narrative. I'll hold a press conference. I'll. Sit down, Lauren snapped, surprising everyone in the room. Her voice was sharp, almost desperate. A press conference won't stop a compliance freeze. We are Hemmer, she stopped herself, corrected. We are losing millions by the hour. Jessica Miller from HR tried to calm the room. If we just... But she was drowned out by overlapping voices. Executives shouting over each other, suggesting absurd fixes, fire half the staff, delay payroll, pressure the vendor with threats. Each idea more desperate than the last, none of them workable. The shouting got so loud that employees sitting outside the glass walls could hear every word. They didn't need details. The tone said everything. Their leaders were unraveling. And then came the moment that sealed it. One of the investors, tired of waiting in the lobby, walked straight into the boardroom. No permission, no announcement. Just walked in. Richard finally looked up. The investor didn't waste time. How much longer? He asked flatly. Lauren's eyes flicked to Richard, begging him to answer. Richard said nothing. Answer the question, the investor pressed. How much longer until you default? The room went still. Tyler opened his mouth, but the investor cut him off with a raised hand. Not you. His gaze landed back on Richard. You. And for the first time, Richard Coleman didn't have silence to hide behind. That was the collapse. Not a crash, not an explosion. Just a man stripped of his aura, his empire exposed as fragile as the rest. Downstairs, the lobby filled with more investors, more whispers, more quiet anger. Upstairs, executives argued themselves hoarse. And everywhere in between, employees watched, phones buzzing with leaked screenshots and half-truths spreading faster than PR could contain them. By sunset, one truth had settled across the entire building like a storm cloud. The company wasn't just struggling anymore. It was finished. And the irony was perfect. The same empire that once paraded its power by humiliating me in front of 200 people was now humiliating itself in front of the entire world. The invitation came in the most predictable way possible, through an email that tried to sound formal but reeked of desperation. Ava, we request your presence for a discussion to resolve outstanding matters. Time sensitive. Please confirm availability. They didn't say negotiation. They didn't say settlement. But I knew what it was. The empire was cornered, and now they were calling the very person they had humiliated to pull them out. I walked into the conference center 2 days later, escorted by my attorney, David Patel. The building was all glass and chrome, designed to intimidate. But intimidation only works when you have power. They didn't anymore. Inside the room, the setup looked rehearsed. Richard Coleman at the head of the table, Tyler at his right, Lauren Davis pale and exhausted, Jessica Miller clutching a folder like it was a life raft. A team of lawyers filled the other chairs, their faces polished, their voices ready to pounce. David and I sat opposite. He placed a slim binder on the table, our evidence packet, neat and lethal. Richard finally spoke, his voice low and deliberate. Ava, this situation has escalated beyond anyone's intentions. We want to resolve this quickly and fairly. I didn't answer. I let David lean forward, calm as ever. Then let's discuss numbers. That single word, numbers, shifted the air. Lawyers shifted in their seats. Lauren's eyes flicked nervously at Richard. Tyler leaned back in his chair, forcing a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. We're prepared to offer a generous settlement, one of the lawyers said, in exchange for your cooperation and discretion moving forward. David opened our binder, flipping to the page with Clause 14. 2 highlighted in bright yellow. You mean in exchange for undoing a freeze you caused yourselves? Let's be clear, my client doesn't need to cooperate. She already complied with policy. The penalties you're facing are your own doing. Tyler slammed his hand on the table. This is extortion. I finally spoke, my voice steady. No. This is accountability. Something you should have learned before handing me a cardboard box. The court reporter in the corner, because of course there was one, looked up at that. I smiled. Please make sure the transcript reflects Mr. Coleman's interruption. Tyler went quiet. Richard exhaled through his nose, the first crack in his stone facade. What do you want, Ava? I leaned forward. What was owed? Severance. Damages. And a formal correction for the lies you used to fire me. Lauren whispered something to Richard, her voice too low for me to catch, but the way his jaw tightened told me the answer. They couldn't fight this. Not anymore. The lawyers scribbled numbers on a pad, sliding it across the table. David didn't even glance at me before shaking his head. Not enough. Back and forth it went. Each time they tried to lowball, David calmly laid out another piece of evidence. Each time Tyler tried to jump in, I shut him down with silence. The room grew hotter, tighter, the glass walls suddenly feeling like a cage. Finally, Richard leaned forward, his voice dropping. Fine. We'll meet your terms. It wasn't defeat shouted in anger. It was defeat whispered by a man who finally realized he'd lost. David closed the binder with a quiet snap. We'll draft the paperwork. I stood, straightened my jacket, and let my final words hang in the air. You should have left me in peace. Instead, you put me on a stage. The glass walls reflected Richard's face back at him, pale and hollow. Tyler stared at the table. The power had flipped. And everyone in that room knew it. The settlement hit my account by sunrise. I sat at the table, watching the numbers appear on the screen. Clean, official, irreversible. Every cent I demanded, plus a bonus they didn't even try to disguise. It was more than I had ever made in a lifetime at that company. But the wire transfer wasn't the real explosion. It was just the echo. The real detonation was happening inside their glass tower, and this time, no contract, no lawyer, no desperate plea could stop it. The freeze had been lifted, yes. Employees clapped when systems flickered back online. Executives tried to fake smiles in front of cameras, muttering about technical issues resolved. But the clock didn't stop just because the lights came back on. Every penalty had already been recorded. Every invoice was already on its way. Hundreds of millions in fines, signed and sealed by the very vendors Richard thought he controlled. And then the bridge loan detonated. The one piece Lauren Davis had tried to keep quiet. The personal guarantee Richard Coleman had signed with his own hand. That paper was now the bank's weapon, and they used it without hesitation. By noon, his accounts were locked. His private assets flagged. Properties moved into receivership. The empire he had built over decades shrank in hours. The boardroom turned into a funeral. Lauren read the final penalty figure out loud, her voice shaking, each number dragging like a stone across the table. People froze. Some stared at the wall. Others buried their faces in their hands. Tyler cursed under his breath, but even he knew words couldn't fill a crater this size. An investor leaned forward, voice sharp enough to cut. Richard, you're finished. Richard didn't answer. He sat in his chair, eyes blank, the silence that once commanded respect now sounding like defeat. For the first time, the man looked small. Not powerful. Not untouchable. Just small. Tyler tried to salvage something, muttering about finding new backers and resetting the narrative. One of the lawyers snapped at him. There is no narrative. There's only debt. The room went dead quiet. And me? I didn't have to lift a finger. I wasn't in that boardroom, I wasn't at that table. But I could feel the shockwave from miles away. Employees messaged me fragments, photos of faces buried in hands, whispers of shouting matches, someone writing, "It's over." He lost everything. I closed the blue binder for the last time and slid it onto the shelf. My work was done. The detonation had played out exactly as written. Richard Coleman had humiliated me in front of 200 people. Now he was the one humiliated in front of the world. The difference? Mine cost him nothing but pride. His cost him an empire. The tower looked different when I returned. No polished shine, no pulse of energy. Just glass that reflected the city like an empty shell. I walked through the lobby with my old badge in hand. Nobody stopped me. Nobody cared. The receptionist didn't even look up from her screen. That said more about the state of the company than any headline ever could. Sandra Ortega was waiting near the gates. She didn't smile. She didn't scold. She just extended her hand, and I dropped the badge into it. She slipped it into an envelope, sealed it, and placed it in a drawer without ceremony. That was the last trace of me inside this building, one plastic rectangle with my name stamped on it. I turned to leave and saw Marcus by the elevators. He leaned against the wall like he'd been waiting for me. No words at first. Just a nod. "You made it out clean," he said finally. "I made it out stronger," I corrected. He gave a short laugh, more tired than amused. "They're done, Ava. Richard's finished. Tyler's hiding. People are polishing their resumes as we speak. I could hear the weight in his voice. He wasn't celebrating. He was surviving. That building was his paycheck, his day-to-day, and now it was disintegrating from the inside. Why didn't anyone speak up that day? I asked. He hesitated, then shook his head. Because fear pays better than truth. But not forever. We let the silence linger. For years, silence had been Richard's favorite weapon. Now it hung in the air like smoke from a burned-out fire. I pushed through the revolving doors, the city air slapping me awake. The streets were loud, cars honking, voices overlapping, phones buzzing, but it all felt distant. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying that building on my back. At the corner, I stopped and looked back. The tower loomed, but it wasn't the same. It wasn't a fortress anymore. It was a tombstone. A monument to arrogance and the price of underestimating the wrong person. I thought of the stage. 200 faces. Tyler's smug grin. Richard's frozen stare. Jessica's fake concern. The silence of everyone else as I walked out with nothing. And now? I had everything. The settlement. The vindication. The knowledge that their empire had collapsed under the weight of its own hypocrisy. They thought they erased me. But I was the one who erased them. I turned back to the street, blending into the crowd. No cameras, no applause, no spotlight. Just me, free and steady, disappearing into the city. Because that's the secret they never understood. Being underestimated wasn't my weakness. It was my weapon. And now I'll ask you, if it had been you standing on that stage, humiliated in front of everyone, would you have walked away quietly? Every story lives as long as it is remembered. A like is your mark on the story, and a subscription is your ticket to the next one.